She was sitting in the kitchen as usual, drinking coffee. Guatemala Antigua. My favorite. Not hers. She drank it only for me. Or used to. I didn't realize at first that I was reading about myself. The story was short. It started almost innocently. A woman in a robe. Her husband by the coffee machine. He says something about bills. She stays silent. And then a single sentence. While he mumbled something about the water, I imagined his voice being replaced by another. Deeper. More alive. I read that line 3 times. First, surprise. Then pain. Then numbness. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a record. Practically a transcript. Same scene, gray robe, mug, the smell of orange peel. I even recognized the sound of the kettle in the background as if I'd heard it in real life. Because I had. I was sitting on the couch. But I wasn't in the story. He was. Jason. And everything he did was what I avoided. He was silent. He watched. He took her hand without asking. I scrolled up, looked for a pseudonym. Leia. An old blog platform, barely any followers. But the text's too honest. Too precise. Not fiction. Not fantasy. It was a report. Claire opened the fridge. I heard the shelf click. Then footsteps. Then her voice. Want more coffee? I nodded. Without looking away from the screen. She poured it. Set it in front of me. I looked at the cup. The same one from the story. Claire went into the other room. I reopened the text. Read it again. And caught on a phrase, he went to take a shower. I couldn't hold back anymore. Our shower. Our blue blanket. Our bed. But in that scene, I was the extra. I was the one who goes to take a shower. Who disappears to make room for someone else. That evening I found another story. About a trip south. We drove in silence. He held my knee. I pretended to sleep. I remember that trip. Only I didn't touch her then. I was driving, counting kilometers to the hotel, wondering what to talk about. Jason was in all the stories. Confident. Quiet. Knew when to act. He showed up where I backed off. Said what I swallowed. Kissed when I waited for a signal. I started looking for patterns. The posts went up at night. Every Wednesday. One exactly the day after I canceled our dinner because of a Zoom with a client. In the story she wrote he didn't cancel. He came even when it rained. Even when I said I hadn't prepared anything. The next morning I got up early. Sat at the kitchen table, watched. Claire in the same robe. Pouring water into the kettle. Silent. I said, "You didn't sleep last night?" She shrugged. Got caught up at the laptop. I looked at her hands. The same ones that held a wine glass in the story. The ones that trembled when he touched her neck. Later, I checked the laptop. Browser cleared. Tabs new. In the evening, she came up to me. Sat down beside me. Asked why I was so quiet. I looked at her. At her face, not unfamiliar. But no longer mine. I think I need a break from coffee, I said. She nodded. And smiled. That smile? The one in the story meant for him. I closed the laptop. Went to the bathroom. Looked at myself in the mirror. Asked aloud. What if Jason is me? And immediately dismissed it. No. He does what I never did. Says what I kept inside. He's not me. He's a replacement. A fantasy made real. Or a truth disguised as fantasy. That night I didn't sleep. And when she came into the bedroom again in the gray robe with a mug of Guatemala Antigua, I realized the scene was already written. And in it I was just a shadow. I searched for proof. Anything. Messages. Photos. Random files. But I found a name. Rick. And in that sound I heard everything. How she used to say my name. But in another voice now. A stranger's. Claire left early. Not her usual way. Said she had things at the university. But the laptop was still there. In the kitchen. Open. As if waiting. Or mocking. I didn't want to pry. I said that out loud. But my fingers had already slid across the trackpad. The screen lit up. A draft. Title, Everything He Didn't Hear. I clicked. The text opened. The first sentence like a blade. Rick always tried to avoid confrontation. He thought gentleness meant care. But all she heard in his voice was absence. Rick. Almost Nick. That's what she used to call me when she whispered. When she was tender. But this wasn't tenderness. This was irony. Detachment. Almost contempt. I wasn't reading anymore. I was swallowing the text. Every line, like a blow to a mirror. She described a man who knew everything but stayed silent because silence was safer than truth. She wrote about how a woman couldn't breathe with him. I shut the laptop. Too sharply, like I'd been caught. But I opened it again immediately. Scrolled down. There it was. based on personal observations. Possibly too close to the skin. I stood up, walked through the apartment. Slowly, like searching for evidence at a crime scene. But everything was perfect. Books alphabetized. Blanket folded. Our rug by the door slightly shifted. But the laundry basket full. And among the usual t-shirts, one shirt. Soft fabric. Lavender scent. I froze. Claire never used lavender. Not in perfume, not in fabric softener. I picked up the shirt. Brought it to my face. Someone else's. Not mine. Door creaked. She was back. I made it in time. Hid the laptop. Closed the basket. Stretched out on the couch like I'd been asleep. Claire walked past. Silent. But the look. A moment too long. As if she was checking. As if she knew I'd already read it. That I wasn't him anymore. Not Rick. That night I didn't sleep. I lay there with my eyes closed. But I heard everything, the sound of her washing up. The light switch click. Then she got up, walked to the window, opened it. Then the rustle of a notebook. She was writing again. In the morning I was the first up. On the table, a fresh cup of coffee. She had made it for me. Or for the habit. I approached. Picked up the cup. Brought it to my lips. But didn't drink. At the bottom, a tiny drop of milk. She always drank hers black. So this one was hers. So the cup wasn't for me. I sat at the table. Opened my phone. Typed into the search, lavender cologne. Men's. The first result. Herbe Parloxetane. Lavender, sage, musk. I recognized that scent. It had been in our bathroom. A few days ago. I thought it was her new shampoo. Now I knew. It was him. Someone with a name but no words yet. No face yet. But a scent. A voice that she threads into her stories. A touch that had replaced my name. Rick. Nick. And now no one. I thought the screen knew everything. That all her scenes lived in the blog. But then I found the notebook. A real one. Paper. And inside scenes that weren't online. But had happened somewhere. I looked for the password. To her old profile. The one she deleted. Or meant to. But instead I found a key. Thin. Silver. With a tag, desk. She rarely locked drawers. But the bottom one always shut. The cabinet creaked. That same sound she hated, like the furniture is ratting us out, she once joked. I moved books aside. Notebooks. And there it was. The notebook. Not new. Dark green cover. Worn like old leather. Pages filled to the edges. Neat, nervous handwriting. No drafts. No arrows or crossouts. As if she wasn't writing, she was remembering. I opened the first page. And I immediately understood this wasn't a blog. Not published. Not signed Leia. This was something else. Scene, the bathroom. White, with a blue stripe along the edge. Just like ours. She sits in the water. Here's someone coming in. I didn't call him. I didn't lock the door. I was just waiting. When he walked in, I wasn't afraid. He touched my neck a bit firmer than needed. A bit more than tenderness. And suddenly I realized I'm alive. I put the notebook down. Got up. Walked a circle around the room. Came back. Read it again. No name was mentioned. But it wasn't me. I would have knocked. I would have asked if I could come in. I would have handed her a towel. But he just walked in. As if he already knew he was allowed. Next scene, evening. Fireplace. A decanter of wine. I remembered our last December. We didn't drink wine. I had a project, she had a deadline. We ate pizza in the kitchen. But in the text she wrote. He poured me red wine. And watched me drink. Didn't speak. Just waited until I looked up. And in that silence I felt heard. I kept flipping pages. 15 more, all scenes. No names. No dates. But the spaces were familiar. Our couch. Our blanket. Only in these texts he was different. And so was she. And then a sentence I reread 10 times. He thinks I still belong to him. Because I smile. Because I'm home. But inside it all burned down long ago. I froze. I remembered how she hugged me one morning recently. How she said, "You're the kindest man I know." And now it sounded like a farewell. Or mockery. I put the notebook back. Too carefully. As if afraid to disturb it. But then returned. Opened it again. The last page was blank. Only a date, May 6th. Today. I shivered. So she'd written this just now? I was sitting in her study. At the desk where she worked. In the chair where she read in the evenings. And suddenly I felt, in her world, I was a guest. An uninvited reader. I felt hot. Though the window was open. I could hear the rain tapping on the glass. The squeak of her umbrella by the door. She was back. I hid the notebook. Closed the drawer. Checked the lock. walked into the hallway, smiled at her. Out of habit. Weakly. Home already? I asked. Got soaked, she replied and walked past me. In the bathroom, white tiles. With a blue stripe. I stood there, staring at the faucet. Remembering the phrase, I was just waiting. Now I knew she had been waiting too. But not for me. I didn't ask questions anymore. I began to observe. Because truth doesn't live in words. It's in the pauses between them. In what's left unexplained. In glances that last too long. In dishes too perfectly clean. In scents that don't belong in our home. Claire still came home at 7. Took off her coat, hung up her scarf. Washed her hands. Smiled. But one day I caught the scent. Masculine. Not hers. Deep. Woody. Not perfume. Cologne. I asked. New laundry detergent? She nodded. Too quickly. Too ready. She never laughed when she wrote about me. And never when she was alone. On the third day, I understood. She writes afterward. Not before. Not during. After the meetings. As if for writing what she can't say out loud. As if she needs not to tell me but to confirm it for herself. I went to the blog. A new story. The heroine in a park. Leaves falling. She writes. He walks toward me unhurried. Not because he's confident. But because he knows I'll stay. I reread it. And I remembered 3 days ago Claire came home in her coat. Dry leaves on her shoulders. But in the city it wasn't the season yet. The leaves weren't falling. Not anywhere except the park on the hill. I knew that. The next morning I went there. Not as an accuser. Not as a husband. As a reader checking the facts. That evening I didn't speak. Didn't look her in the eyes. Just handed her a cup. She took it. And suddenly said, "You're so attentive." I nodded. But in my mind, attention is all I have left. She no longer waits for my words. So I watch. I opened the laptop. Went to her blog. And clicked archive. There was an old post. Titled, "I write so I don't burn." Now I knew it didn't always help. She had lied. But not directly. She called fiction a fantasy. And I heard in it our voice. Our silence. Everything we didn't say but felt. That evening she offered wine. Claire almost never drinks. But suddenly a glass with rosemary. Olives. Soft music. As if we were somewhere in the South. As if we were a couple that still wanted to be one. I just wanted an evening outside of routine, she said. Just to talk. I sat across from her. Too carefully. As if the trap was already hidden under the napkin. She told me she was writing a new story. About a woman who invents a romance. Only in her head. No one's really there. Just her and the thought of him. She just needs a place where she feels alive, Claire said, looking into her wine. I nodded. Not out of agreement, out of fear that if I spoke, the scene would fall apart. And I needed to hear it to the end. Then, a pause. And a question. You know this isn't about us, right? I stayed silent. Because if I had said anything, my voice would have broken. She went on. I write so I don't do. So I can stay faithful at least with my body. I clenched my hands under the table. On the outside, trust. Inside, a scream. This is what betrayal without touch looks like. This is what honesty sounds like when it hides treason. I asked. And what if someone thinks you already did? She smiled. Gently. Like a teacher explaining a hard equation. That's not a fact, Nick. It's just language. Everyone has their own. After dinner she went to the bedroom. Said she'd finish writing. I stayed in the kitchen. The plates still smelled of rosemary. And somehow the fact that the evening was almost beautiful hurt the most. Her laptop was on the couch. Not shut. Not closed. On the screen, a half-erased paragraph. He said, "You made all of this up, didn't you?" She nodded. Because sometimes a lie is what saves both of them. So they can at least have one more dinner together. I didn't know what hurt more. That she hadn't done it. Or that it was enough for her just to write it. I went to the bathroom. Turned on the faucet. Splashed cold water on my face. Looked in the mirror. And suddenly realized. I would have lied too. For one more dinner. For that lie. The next morning I handed her coffee. She thanked me. And suddenly said, "Did you know yesterday's story was old?" I just rewrote it. I said nothing. Because I knew. She wasn't rewriting a text. She was rewriting reality. I stopped being a participant. Became a reader. And every new word pinned me to the floor. Like a nail to the stage of a play where everything was already decided. The roles assigned. The scripts written. I was in the background. Without lines. I read her stories at night. Instead of sleeping. While she slept beside me. Or rather, while she lay beside me. Because in those texts she woke from someone else. From a touch, from a glance. From a name. The name changed, Jason. Mark. Now Alex. But the essence stayed the same. He comes when nothing else matters. When the rightful one is asleep. The rightful one. Me. Like a legal term. Not a person. I became afraid to fall asleep. Because in my sleep I heard the creak of a chair. Her steps. The keyboard clicking steady without pauses. As if she wasn't the one typing. As if someone else was, through her. Like the breath of another. More alive. I tried to remember the last time she looked at me like a man. Not as convenience. Not as certainty. But as someone she wanted. I couldn't. Only shadows came to mind. Only phrases, you understand, right? It's all imagination. A new story appeared on the blog. It began like this. Sometimes it's easier to leave the ring on your finger. Fewer questions that way. I read to the end. And then turned to her. Her hand on the pillow. The ring in place. But her fingers trembling slightly. I stared at that trembling like a sign. She was already gone. Only her body hadn't caught up yet. I got up. Went to the bathroom. Splashed cold water on my face. Looked up. On the mirror, a handprint. Hers. Damp. Translucent. As if she had been holding on. So she wouldn't drown. Or hoping someone would pull her out. I pressed my hand to the print. Almost the same shape. Almost matched. And suddenly I felt. This wasn't a call. It was a trace. Not a plea for help. But a sign that I was too late. That night I didn't read. I just sat. Staring at the screen. Waiting for the next chapter. Like a verdict. I no longer searched for evidence. I simply stopped returning. Because sometimes betrayal isn't cheating. It's being unseen. In the kitchen, it smelled like baked pears. Her favorite recipe. She always made them when she wanted to make peace. As a sign. As a gesture. But I wasn't angry. I simply felt nothing. Claire talked about work. About a student. A new program. I nodded. At the right times. Mechanically. But in my head, one thought echoed. I'm no longer part of this dialogue. That evening I opened her blog. One last time. A new story. No names. Only feelings. The heroine walks down a street. Carrying a box of books. He said he understood everything. But stayed silent. And that silence was the most terrifying confession. I closed the laptop. And realized. That scene had happened already. Only before the box held his things. Now hers. I stood up. Opened the closet. Packed a few shirts. Socks. A book I hadn't finished. Everything slowly. No rush. No anger. On the shelf, a card. She'd given it to me 2 years ago. For my birthday. On the cover, a drawing of a forest. Inside, her handwriting. You are my silence. In it, I feel safe. I reread it. And I knew. I was no longer her silence. I had become her echo. The sound that lingers when the room is empty. I placed the card on top of the clothes. Then the bag. Zipped it. Lifted it. Before leaving, I looked around the room. A chair slightly pulled out. A mug half full. On the screen, a blinking cursor. I walked out. No slamming door. No checking if she'd notice. And not knowing if she would return to that scene without me. I had expected the truth to be about the body. A kiss. A meeting. Something external. Tangible. Something that could be forgiven. Or at least accused. But the truth was in a file. Created a year ago. Labeled, do not publish. Ever. A week has passed since I left. I haven't written. She hasn't either. And then one message. Simple. If you want to understand, go to my draft. No password. Just open it. I went back. To an empty apartment. Where everything was in its place. Except for us. The same books on the shelf. The same mugs. Only the air different. As if the walls had forgotten our voices. The laptop was on the table. Open. The screen asleep. As if waiting to be touched. I pressed a key. It woke up. The file was titled, You. Not him. Dated October of last year. So, before everything. Before Jason. Before Rick. Before I began to suspect. Before I stopped listening and started watching. I read. He thinks I'm looking for someone else. That Jason is my rebellion. But the truth is Jason is him. Just the way he used to be for me. Before he got scared. Before he started disappearing even while being right there. The lines went on. Steady. Honest. Unvarnished. I write because he doesn't ask. Because he went into himself. And I was left alone with my desires, my body, the silence. I create others because I'm losing him. I don't want to cheat. I want to be seen. He stays silent and I begin to scream, but only on paper. I close the laptop. Softly. Almost with respect. As if returning something that didn't belong to me. I didn't know if she had cheated. Maybe she had. Maybe only in writing. Maybe only inside. In the mirror I didn't see a traitor. But I didn't see a husband either. I saw a reflection tired of being significant. Now that the truth was out, it wasn't clear who it destroyed more. Me? Her? Us? And the scariest thing was that she might never finish the scene. Because we had both already stepped off the stage. We were no longer enemies. But no longer together. Like actors after the play, who had performed pain and remained in an empty theater. We met in a cafe, where we once laughed. Now just a conversation. No tension. No hope. Claire came with no makeup, wearing the same coat I recognized from the story. Sleeves slightly worn. Hair undone. Not for anyone. Just to exist. I didn't ask if there had been someone. She didn't explain. That was our final honesty. Not to touch what would never be said out loud anyway. Claire said, I didn't know how else to survive. Writing was like breathing. When you stopped hearing me, I nodded and replied. I thought silence would save us. But it turns out it drowns. We spoke calmly, as if we'd already lived through it all. As if the pain was tired, and the confessions came too late to matter. I noticed how she looked at me. Not like a man, not even like an ex, but like the only witness. The one who saw her as she truly was and let her go. Before leaving, she pulled out an envelope. No name, just my address and her handwriting. Clear, unadorned. She didn't say what was inside. Just, this is the last one. I'm not writing anymore. I opened it on the subway. On my knees, a white sheet. One short story. He stood at the door. No longer angry. Just there. I looked at him and for the first time understood. I didn't lose a man. I lost a person. Who believed that I was whole. I didn't grieve. Didn't reread. I just folded the page. Carefully. Like an ending that couldn't be rewritten. When I stepped off, I didn't look back. Claire stayed at the cafe. Maybe still in the same seat. Maybe already someone else. But I knew one thing. This time she wouldn't write a scene about us. Because everything had already happened. And because silence now wasn't emptiness but an answer. I no longer read her stories. Not because I forgave. But because they're no longer about me. And I'm no longer obligated to live inside them. I rented a new apartment. White walls. One chair. One cup. Empty. But I can breathe. The morning began without Claire's voice. Without the smell of her coffee. I brewed my own. Guatemala Antigua. For the first time for myself. Not as a ritual. As a choice. A phone notification. A new post on her blog. I didn't open it. I just unsubscribed. And it wasn't a gesture. It was a release. I cut the last thread that kept me tied to her imagined world. I started coding again. Not like before, out of exhaustion. But because I can build. Because now in my hands is logic. Not emotion. I assembled a computer from scratch. Every part in my hands. Not in her stories. On the weekend I went to a bookstore. Bought a novel. Not by her favorite author. Mine. I don't need to prove to anyone that I read deeply. I just read. And one night, lying in silence, I realized I wasn't boring. I was alive. Just not in her genre. Now, I don't look for myself in someone else's chapters. I write my own. Without pseudonyms. Without heroes stronger than me. Without her. And this isn't an ending. It's the first page, where I am the main character. Not because I was chosen, but because I'm finally living. Not in her world, but in my own.